Well, we are in week 7 of a 9-part series titled The Most Important Story You've Never Been Told. And if you are brand new today or you haven't been here in a while, I encourage you to go back and watch some of the messages that are online. But if there's one idea that I want to get across in these entire 9 weeks of preaching on this topic, it is this, that the Bible is the sequential story, meaning like one thing happens, and then something else happens, and then another thing happens. There's a sequence of events. And, you know, the thing that originally happened, it was really important, but you got to understand that things have been happening along the way, and that we're over here now because it's been a sequence of events. The Bible is the sequential story, and the events are these 4 covenants, these 4 sets of promises that establish partnerships of various kinds that lead to a 5th and final covenant that we celebrate here when we celebrate communion, where Jesus takes a cup and he says, this is the cup of the new covenant, the final covenant that establishes us as people of faith. The new covenant, I've said in the weeks past, is unilateral, unconditional, and unlimited. It's unilateral, meaning that only one party is making the set of promises and establishing the partnership. God and God's action out of God's love with you and every you've ever been next to establishes this set of promises and partnerships. It's unilateral, it's unconditional. You can't earn your way in. There isn't a set of rules, and if you get 7 out of 10, you're in, but 6 out of 10, you're out. It's unconditional, and it's unlimited. There's no expiration date on this. It's never too late to believe and become part of this partnership based on the good promises of God. It's a new covenant. It's a new relationship, and it is a game changer. And everything in the biblical story, it leads up to this covenant, and we as Christian people, and maybe you're undecided, maybe you're still trying to figure this out, and that's okay. This is a place where you can have doubts and you can ask questions. Perfect place for that. But to be a Christ follower means that we're under this new covenant. And if there's a new covenant, there must be an old covenant. And the writers of the New Testament also could be translated as covenant, the writers of the new covenant, the Christian part of our scripture, they refer to the covenant made with the people of ancient Israel as the old covenant. You've heard of the 10 Commandments, but there's 613 rules. It's bilateral. God says, I want to make this partnership with you, and I have all these promises to make with you. And the people of Israel, they say, yeah, we're in, and they make that official. It's conditional. You have to follow these rules and follow these laws, and if you do, I'll protect you. If you don't, I won't. And it's limited. It's limited to the people of ancient Israel. That was the old covenant, the backstory, but now we're under the new covenant. And the most important story you've never been told, maybe some of you have heard it, but most of you probably haven't heard about the Bible in terms of the sequential story with these 4 covenants that lead to a 5th and final covenant. And therefore, it's easy to get confused. In fact, if you want to learn more, there's a book that we're studying as a church. It's on Thursday nights. Even though you've missed the first few sessions, you could come. We watch a video. It'll get you up to speed. And this book, it is written by Andy Stanley. It's called Irresistible. And Andy says, I am convinced that it's the mixing, blending, and integration of the old, meaning the old covenant way of thinking and being in the world, rigid, rule-based. It's the blending and integration of the old with the new covenant that makes the modern church so resistible. And odds are you know some people that find the church very resistible. They find the church to not be something they're interested in. Maybe one of your adult children, maybe a friend. And Andy says that the reason for that is this mixing and blending of the old and the new. Let me give you a taste of the old covenant, in case you're unfamiliar with what exactly this is. This is from Exodus 21, the second book of the Bible. This is God speaking through the prophet Moses. He says this, and mind you, these rules are to establish this group of former slaves as a community. So it's going to deal with real issues. And so God says through the prophet Moses, But if there is serious injury, and injuries happen in communities, right? Sometimes people get hurt. If there's serious injury, sometimes even in our community, somebody might get injured. Maybe it's an emotional injury or a social injury. But, if there's something big that happens, here's what you are to do. This is the old covenant. This is not a suggestion. If you're going to follow the laws and be faithful to it, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound. It goes on like that. Let me ask you a question then. In light of this is just one of the rules. There's lots of them. Are disciples of Jesus required to follow the rules found in the Old Testament? Let me put it a different way. How many of you are familiar with the 10 Commandments? Now, as disciples of Jesus, are you required to follow the 10 Commandments? Raise your hand if you think yes. Yeah, quite a few of us, yeah. Generally, I like to have an environment where, free thought, think what you want, but let me tell you, no, you are not required to follow the 10 Commandments as a disciple of Jesus. Got your interest now, don't I? You're like, I'm about out of here. This guy's lost his mind. Let me make your case, okay? This is so important because the title of today's message is Better Than Rules. And Jesus offers us something better than rules. But let me just qualify why I think, no, you are not required to follow the 10 Commandments as a disciple of Jesus. There's 3 reasons. First of all, the rules are part of a covenant with ancient Israel, not you. Unless you somehow can go back in time and become part of the people group called ancient Israel, this is not for you. Here's a little excerpt of the covenant that God makes with ancient Israel. He says, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you. Who's the you? The you ain't you. That's who. It's made with ancient Israel. Secondly, ancient Israel broke the covenant over and over again, and God said it would be replaced. Specifically, the prophet Jeremiah, God speaking through the prophet says, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant. This is in the Hebrew scripture. Third, Jesus claims to fulfill the old covenant and start the new covenant. Around the year 32 AD, he says, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. That's what we do when we celebrate communion. We remember this important moment where everything changed. Later, about 30 years later, a writer, an anonymous writer who wrote a letter that we call Hebrews, he says this, by calling this covenant new, he, as in Jesus, as in God, through the prophet Jeremiah, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. I bought the first iPad that ever came out. Anybody ever generation 1 of the iPad? Yeah. And you know what happened? Eventually, you couldn't update it any longer. And because you couldn't get the new operating system, you couldn't get the new apps, and all of a sudden, it became outdated and obsolete. And even though I paid a bunch of money for it back in, what year would that have been? Like 2010 or something? I don't even know. Way back then, when I didn't have much money, and I paid a lot of money, I got this cool iPad, I gave it away for free because it was outdated and obsolete, and it disappeared. And the writers of the New Testament, Jesus is announcing the new covenant, and the writers are saying the old covenant, when he called the new covenant new, he made the old covenant outdated and obsolete. Now, many people walk away from the church because they feel it is outdated and obsolete. Perhaps you know somebody that has felt this way. Maybe you've been this way. It's outdated, The church has been holding on to its traditions, and those traditions no longer speak to the next generation, and the church is acting as if its mission is just to pass on traditions rather than the good news of Jesus Christ. And all of a sudden, for the next generation or the generation after, it just feels outdated and therefore obsolete. Or there's like a structure, a hierarchical structure, typically where men are all in charge, and the church is thinking that its whole role is to pass down that structure and make sure the right people are in charge and the wrong people are there in the other position, and it just feels outdated and obsolete and it doesn't work. Maybe it's a viewpoint on whose love is okay and acceptable. Maybe it's a particular way of reading the Bible, a literal, simplistic approach to the Bible that claims to hold the Bible up in high esteem, but yet doesn't do the work to really understand the context of the Bible. And people have grown up in that tradition, and they go, well, that just doesn't make sense the way you're translating that, and that just goes against something in my heart, and it just feels outdated. That's an old approach. That's a tired approach. That's an anti-intellectual approach. It's outdated and it's obsolete. And many people have walked away because of this experience. And some of you, you've told me your stories. You've had these experiences. And if you've had that experience, if you know somebody that's had that experience, let me just tell you, the parts that make the church feel like it's outdated and obsolete should have never been part of the church in the first place. And if you read the writings of the Apostle Paul, and we went through these several weeks ago, this issue of mixing and blending the old covenant into the new and changing the new covenant into something that it was never supposed to be, that was an issue right from the beginning. The Apostle Paul was working against that tendency to smuggle in parts of the rule-keeping old covenant into the new. But the new covenant, it is better than rules. But you might be thinking, okay, it's better than rules, but how should we think about the rules in the Old Testament? Because, you know, I see it. Now I finally understand. You know, it was going kind of well, and I was getting with you, Pastor Scott, but now you're talking there's no rules. You got something better than rules. I see it. You're one of those hippy-dippy, free love, no rules, Jesus freaks, okay? I thought we were in a serious Bible church all along, but you're just, oh, everything's okay. That's not what I believe. I take the viewpoint I think that Jesus takes. And we're going to look at that view and see how Jesus, he offers something better than rules. And once you see it, you'll understand it. So we're going to go to the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached. Hold up your hand. You got 5 fingers. Matthew chapter 5. You can go home, read it tonight for free. It costs you nothing. It'll make a big impact on your life. And Jesus, you know, he's dealing with this kind of like accusation that maybe he's this hippy-dippy free love Jesus. And he says, look, do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Law and the prophets is Jesus' way of saying the entire story of the Old Covenant or the Old Testament. Don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Why would he say that? It's because people thought that's what he was up to, but he wasn't. No, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them, to bring them to their designated end. You see, those 4 covenants that make up the law and the prophets, they were always pointing to this 5th and final covenant that Jeremiah predicted and that Jesus announced. It says, for truly, I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Until everything is accomplished. Now, at the end of the Jesus' story, when he's up on the cross and he's about to die, he says, it is finished. And some scholars believe that when he says this at the beginning of his ministry, that until everything is accomplished, that at the end of his ministry on the cross, when he says that it is finished, that those 2 things are tied together. Some scholars don't believe that, others do. I find that compelling. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, he's saying, I'm preaching this sermon, I'm here, but there's things I need to do before this thing is done. But once I'm done with it, we will be fully into the new covenant because it's a sequential story and things need to happen. And we're at the beginning of the story, but at the end of the story, it will be accomplished, it will be finished. And when that comes, it will lead to a period where the new covenant takes over and the old covenant begins to disappear. Now, fact from history. In 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem is burned to the ground by the Romans after a group of Jews rebelled against the Roman Empire. And the old covenant way of religion, of ancient Judaism, that revolved around the temple, it disappeared. So Jesus is pointing to this moment. But we're not there yet. This gets a little confusing though, okay? So if you're to read this on your own without the context of these covenants, this would be difficult because Jesus says, therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly would be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And you might be thinking, well, hold on a second. He's talking about it disappearing, when it's accomplished, when it's finished, this sort of thing. But now it kind of seems like he's saying you need to teach all these commands. Like, what's going on here? And then Jesus says something that will really throw you into a point of confusion if you don't understand the sequential story. He says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness, your way of life, your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And this is confusing because it seems that Jesus is saying that we must be better rule followers than the best rule followers. Because the Pharisees are the best rule followers in the day and age. The teachers of the law, these are the people that know the 613 laws, but they have something called the oral law that they put around the 613 written laws. It's, a bunch of unwritten rules, and it's what scholars call hedging. They put all these oral laws on top of the written laws so that you would never get close to breaking the written laws. And I've given this example many times in various settings that, like, one of my rules for my 5-year-old son, Jack, is he may not play in the street. That's the rule, because it's dangerous. And so I could tell him, you may not play beyond the sidewalk. Or I could put another hedge on it and say, you may not play in the front yard, because if he never goes in the front yard, he'll never get into the street. Or I could say, another hedge, you might not play outside. There's no chance he'll be in the street if he stays inside. This is what they did. And so they were the best rule followers. And Jesus says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, you will not be able to be in the kingdom of heaven. To which you might be thinking this question: how can we be gooder than the goodiest do-gooders? You're thinking that, right? How can you be gooder than the goodiest do-gooders? And if you're thinking that question, Jesus has got you right where he wants you. He's got you leaning in. He's got you thinking. And he's like, all right. Now that you're thinking about how can I be a better rule follower than the best rule followers? How do I have a righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees? He says, you know what? I'm going to give you 6 examples. And it's going to be, lighthearted stuff like murder and adultery and divorce and oaths and revenge and enemies. And I'm going to show you something better than rules. I'm going to show you a righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees. I'm going to show you how to be a better do-gooder than the goodiest do-gooders there are. It's going to be something better than rules. You heard it was said to the people long ago. Who said it? Moses. He's referring to the old covenant here. You heard it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. That's one of the big 10. You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And lots of you probably still convinced, as a Jesus follower, I got to follow that. But I'm telling you, Jesus got something better than rules. That was the old covenant. Hear what Jesus says. But I tell you, as in new covenant, that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. You see, if you manage your anger, you don't need a rule forbidding murder. If you learn to manage your anger, anger is part of life. It's a human emotion, and we all have anger. But some people, your anger just gets out of control, and you do things that you wish you wouldn't have done out of anger. And then when that anger goes away, you hopefully feel shame and embarrassed. If you learn to manage that anger, you won't need a rule forbidding murder. You'll never even get close to murdering somebody. Jesus moves on to adultery. He says, you have heard it was said. Who said it? Come on now. Moses. Say it together. Moses. Old covenant. You heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. You're like, I should follow that one. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Ladies, I don't know if this is an issue for you, but men, I do. Right? And Jesus is saying, if you manage your heart, he says, manage your heart or lust will tear your relationship apart. But if you can manage your heart and you can keep yourself in the right place, adultery you won't need a rule for that. You'll never get close to that. It's better than rules. Skipping divorce and oaths, we'll just go to revenge. Jesus says, you've heard it was said by who? Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. You're like, I did just hear that, didn't I? Yeah, we started with that. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, just point out a couple things. First of all, it says slaps you. We're talking about an insult, not an injury. And unfortunately, this teaching has been used in some Christian contexts to say that a woman who is being beaten by her man should stay in that household and just turn the other cheek when she's being abused and injured. That's not the intent here. This is an insult. If somebody insults you in that sort of way, that's the time we turn the other cheek. If somebody is injuring you, you get out of that place. The other thing it says, do not resist, and the Greek word, the connotation is do not respond violently. To put it another way, I got this from Eugene Peterson, who writes the Message. What Jesus is saying is don't mirror evil. Don't mirror evil. Don't return insult for insult, dishonor for dishonor. No more tit for tat approach to life. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That was old covenant. We got something better than rules. You're just not going to return insult for insult, dishonor for dishonor. No tit for tat. Well, it's fair. He did it to me. That's old covenant thinking. We're in something better. Going to enemies. You heard it was said by Moses, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, in the Old Covenant, it doesn't say hate your enemy. It says love your neighbor. But if you read the story of the Old Covenant, of the Old Testament, you can see why Jesus would put this in there. Because there was a sense of eye for an eye. There was a sense of they're against us. And there was a lot of hatred to people that were not part of ancient Israel in that story, their own story. But I tell you, love your enemies. Love your enemies. How am I going to do that, Jesus? Because that's kind of ridiculous, you know? This is this point where, like, a lot of us, we go, you know, Christianity's nice and everything, and I like going to worship, and the music's good, and the fellowship's nice, and there's brownies today, so that was great, you know? And, like, but, you know, when they start talking about loving enemies, like, that's kind of absurd. Who does that? How in the world would you love your enemies? Jesus tells you. You pray for those who persecute you. You pray for those who persecute you. You pray that somehow God would bless them, that God would change their hearts, that God would do something good in their lives. You realize that they are a child of God too. You pray for them because, look, prayer prepares your heart. It prepares your heart. And if you're angry and hateful on the inside, there's no way you'll be able to love that person when they're in front of you. But if you pray and you say, God, you know, it is by your grace that I'm forgiven of my trespasses, of my debts, of the sins that I've committed, that I'm a person under grace, that I'm a person that needs forgiveness, your ability to forgive others and love others, it grows. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Why would we do that, Jesus? So that everything would go well for you. Everybody would look at you and be like, hey, look at that great shiny Christian over there, you know? Why would we love our enemies? I mean, that's like as hard as it gets, isn't it? Anybody here have any enemies? You know, no, I won't make you raise your hand. I mean, we don't think in those categories, at least I don't, but you know, you got people that hurt you, people that seem against you. Why would you pray for those people? So that you may be children of your Father in heaven. You see, the new covenant standard is not a set of rules. The new covenant standard is better than rules. It's God's character. And with rules, there's a workaround. If you're a good lawyer, you can manipulate the rules in your favor almost always. You can always find a loophole. You can always find a workaround. You can always find a way to justify your hypocrisy and lack of following those rules while pointing out how other people are not following the rules. With rules, there's workarounds. And as we've talked about in the weeks before, the old covenant, this rule-keeping way to righteousness, it will mess you up. It will make you a hypocrite. It will make you full of fear and judgment. The new covenant is better than rules. Its standard is God's character. There's no workaround characters. There's no manipulation of following somebody's character. You're either reflecting the image of the Creator or you're not. You're either walking in the way Jesus walked or you're not. Character is far more compelling. Here's what Jesus says about God's character. He says, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The New Testament standard is not rules, it is God's character. And the God that Jesus reveals to us is a God who lets his sun rise on the evil and the good, the rain fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. It's a God that blesses people that deserve it and blesses people that don't deserve it. It is a God of grace, unearned, undeserved favor. It is the new covenant that God is under. That is our standard. And Jesus sums up this whole section by saying, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And perfection, it's moving in God's direction. It's not about getting everything right. It's about moving in the direction of God's character and trying to reflect God's character out into this world. Allowing your sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. Allowing your rain, allowing your blessing, allowing your goodness to go for those that deserve it and even those that don't. It's a different way of being in the world. So here's the application. Set your standard on God's character rather than God's old covenant commands. It's not that the 10 Commandments are bad. It's not that we're abolishing them. They've just been fulfilled. We got something better than rules. It's God's character. It's the new covenant. And if you begin to reflect God's character, you don't need those rules. If you manage your heart and you manage your anger, you don't need a rule forbidding murder. If you manage your heart and you manage your lust, you don't need a rule forbidding adultery. If you pray for those that persecute you, you won't respond tit for tat to your enemies. You won't mirror that evil. You see, you weren't created to be a rule follower. You're not very good at it anyways. You're not created to be a rule follower. You were created to be a Christ follower. Put it another way, you were made to shine light, not avoid darkness. I think it was Judy in her testimony said that one Jesus that she learned was one that was all about what she didn't do. That's the rule following. That's old covenant. That's mixing and blending some of that. But the Jesus that is compelling is the one that says, this is the character of God and you were created in that God's image. And look at what your life could be like if you start reflecting that character. If you stop trying to respond insult to insult. If you manage your heart. You were created beautiful to make an impact on this world. But you have to have the right goal in mind. And you reflect on God's character, on what Jesus reveals. You let the life of Jesus inspire you to be the best reflection of that character that you can be. And you focus on shining light into this world, not avoiding darkness. So where does your character reflect God's character? That's what I want you to think about. Not where do you need to reflect God's character? I mean, that's a good question too. But already in your life, I just want you to be affirmed today as you leave. Already in your life, God's character is shining through in some sort of way. Where is that reflecting? And then let that light shine. Because, God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And you have good people in your world, and you got some people that are not so good. You got righteous people and the unrighteous people. You have all sorts of opportunity to reflect the character of God. This is the standard of the new covenant. It is better than rules. And honestly speaking, most of us, I know me, probably all of us, we weren't very good rule followers in the first place. But if we get our hearts right, we don't need those rules. We won't even get close to breaking them, because we'll be shining that light that God has put in each of us. It's a different way of being in the world. In just a moment, we're going to invite you to come up. And we're going to take the bread and the wine together. And Jesus, he says of the bread, this is my body. It is broken for you. That he has sacrificed himself to show us this love, this unconditional love that will go to any length to share it with the world. This is my body broken for you. And then he holds up the cup and says, this is the cup of the new covenant, this new arrangement, this thing that will make us different in this world, this thing the world needs. It says it's poured out in his blood. And if you're going to love your enemies, if you're going to be a follower of the new covenant, it's not that you're getting this free love, hippy-dippy Jesus approach to life. Actually, it's going to cost you. Praying for your persecutors, it will cost you. But it is worth it, and it makes all the difference.